Hello, I'm Bradkelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
Okay, today I am joined by none other than Patrick Eha, a widely published essayist, journalist, and critic, one of my favorite writers on books and culture. I'll have links to his stuff in the show notes, of course. And I reached out to Brian because I talked to him back when I was doing Art of Darkness, and I really enjoyed the conversation so much. And since then, I've been keeping up with his various articles on this and that, a couple of which we were going to talk about. And just really enjoyed it and wanted to have this conversation again. So, Brian, thank you for joining me. And how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Brad. Thanks for having me. I'm stoked to be on your new pod, and
Awesome.
I'm really happy with how it's going for you, how it's been kind of growing and going from strength to strength so far.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that. One thing we were kind of trying to set this up, as is fairly common, there's always some sort of scheduling tricks, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to be doing this, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to have this going on. It seems like you've had a fair amount, and usually 60% of that's on my end, and I find some little poke hole in my daily schedule to do this. But Brian, I know you've had some travel going on, and let me just kind of set this up, why I'm curious about this and why I'm interested in this. And we don't have to dig too deep into this thing I'm going to say about Gerald Murnane, but I'm working on some stuff around Gerald Murnane's The Plains, and you realize that man never went anywhere.
I love that novel.
So good.
I have to say. Yeah.
It's incredible. The Plains is incredible. But you realize he never went anywhere. I mean, he barely ever.
No.
I don't think he ever left Australia, and he rarely leaves the tiny little.
I think he's never been on an airplane.
As far
even
as I
within
know,
Australia.
yeah,
I think he's never been on
Yeah,
an
I think he
airplane.
took a boat to Tasmania one time. I think that's the extent of his travel. Right. So, but it got me thinking. A lot of writers are travelers to some extent, and obviously, in the case of Murnane, who is as good as anybody, apparently you can get away without traveling. But I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of your travels recently, and maybe how you see that folding into your work as a writer.
Yeah, so I was most recently in Hungary, mainly Budapest, but I took a day trip to Esztergom, which is this city of about 29,000 people on the banks of the Danube River, bordering Slovakia, actually. It's about an hour by train from Budapest, and I'm now writing a short story that draws on a visit I made there in June. I'm very inspired by travel. I think that for a writer, the dislocation often helps. You can see things from a different perspective in a new way. You can, of course, gather, new experiences in foreign places. But for me, as someone who, I think one reason I like foreign travel is that when I feel kind of out of place and dislocated in a foreign country, it makes sense because, well, I'm in a foreign country after all. I am out of place. Whereas, at home, for many of us maybe who are a little bit odd or out of the mainstream, if you feel kind of out of place and dislocated at home, maybe there's not as ready of an explanation for it, and it can be a little harder to take. But no, I mean, in many ways, I just love exploring new places and finding myself in unexpected situations. And I find that there's an openness that comes with travel. I've recently been reading the journals of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he talks about the very same thing, that you kind of wake up with each day feeling just totally open and free, like this whole space of freedom where, you can do anything with it. But the one thing I guess I would want to talk about most is this past spring I spent some time in Seoul in South Korea, which is just one of my favorite cities in the world. And while I was there, I was rereading Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is this, you probably know, this incredible blend of sort of historical fiction, speculative fiction, and philosophical meditation. And I was thinking a lot about cities in general, reading this book, and about the contrast between Seoul and New York, where I live. And at the same time, I was walking in my own footsteps from the last time I was over there and feeling kind of ghostly echoes everywhere. And so I started to think about this foreign city as like a kind of Heraclitean river, which you can't set foot in twice because it isn't the same place and you're not the same person. And I started jotting down notes. At first, it was in the margins of my copy of Calvino's book, which was new for me because I never write my work in longhand, even as a first draft. But as I went on, the notes became more elaborate. I soon didn't have room for them in the margins, and this narrative started to emerge. I found myself being kind of like Charles Kinbote in Nabokov's Pale Fire, like weaving my own story like a creeper vine around quotations in Calvino's text, and or from Calvino's text, and Invisible Cities, for those who don't know, it consists of like 73 vignettes. And as I went through them one by one, it just became this story of loss and longing, and also a kind of love letter to Seoul, and my own fantasies and desires and emotions came into it, my own philosophical speculations. So I got through all 73 vignettes and immediately went back to the beginning and worked it all through again, all 73, because some of them were like too skimpy at first or didn't serve the story which had developed. So it just had its hooks in me, and I built it up in layers, like 25,000 words now, like a novella or short novel. But really it's a hybrid. It's kind of literary criticism as prose poetry as philosophical essay as erotic novel as travel diary, and diary as criticism. So
wow,
it's a strange hybrid, but hopefully an appealing one. And I don't know quite what to do with it yet, but obviously I'd love to publish it somewhere,
sure.
Probably with like a small, experimental press. So yeah, if any editors are out there listening to this long spiel, feel free to drop me a line.
No, that sounds really cool. I love this idea I love the idea of it, and it seems somehow appropriate for Calvino of another book sort of sprouting out of his book like a tree, kind of, just. That's wonderful. I love the creativity of that, and I love the vision of that. That's very cool.
Yeah, it was totally organic. I had no idea what to expect. At first, I thought I was, writing like a little travel diary. Then I thought, okay, I'm writing like a kind of, literary essay, and then it just grew and grew, and but it's got all these kind of layers built into it, from the. Anyway, I like it.
We look forward to that. As you were talking about the Heraclitean River, I recently visited. Well, not even recently. It's like January of this year. I went back to Austin, Texas. I hadn't been there in like 10 years. And what's interesting about that place is it's grown so rapidly. Like 10 years is actually like 50 years in another city. And and so in my head, I was just there, in a way. And I go back, and it's like having this, not quite a nightmare, but like a strange dream about the place, because it'll be like, oh, I remember that taco place, but there's a skyscraper right next to it that's totally unfamiliar. Do you know what I mean? So it's like there's this like thread of very, very familiar places I've been and streets I'd walked and that kind of thing. And then over top of it, there's this whole other place that's completely new to me. It was a very disorienting experience. I mean, it was cool in a way, but also at the same time, it was like, oh, this is not actually, to me, this is not actually the city I thought it was anymore. It's something different, and maybe it would be awesome if I spent some more time here, but
Right. I mean, the implication, the deeper implications of that famous quote from Heraclitus is, it really gets to the core of identity, and to what extent are we remaining ourselves, or is any place remaining itself,
right?
Or if there is a continuity of identity, if there's some unchanging core, then to what extent do we remain ourselves actually by changing, by being forced to change, or to what extent does the change actually change us at the core, and to what extent does a city that you love have to kind of outgrow you even as you grow apart from it. And then this fed into thinking about relationships between people and how they also so you can see the implications there.
No, I love it. And I think I think you're right on that this is part of why travel sort of inspires these things. I mean, and then you take in addition to it the sort of the jarring you out of routine. There is a certain amount of gaining sort of new experiences, but I've always thought that was slightly oversold to a certain degree. Not that new experiences aren't great, but their value for a writer, I kind of feel like, and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe this is just my bias, I kind of feel like no matter what kind of life you live, it's going to throw enough novelty and different things at you that it's what you make of that rather than whether it happens or not, right? It's sort of like life's going to be weird, and it's weird. It's the more novel and the stranger by you actually paying attention to it, if that makes sense. And I think that's kind of why Murnane can maybe pull off what he's doing, because for him, he's all in his head. It doesn't matter. In a way, it doesn't even matter to him where he is. You know, it's all going on inside in this sort of the galaxy in between his ears.
Or, I mean, the galaxy between your ears also takes on the kind of form of that world around you, which may be narrow. I mean, think about Kafka actually traveled a fair amount. You know, he went to Italy and Switzerland, I think, and these other places. But, you know, how much of his work is kind of based on those semi-exotic, you know, destinations that he went to versus how much of it is just influenced by what was happening at his desk every day, you know, working in insurance. Like, it, obviously that kind of what we would call a corporate, you know, atmosphere plays a much greater role in his work than, you know, the open air of like the, you know, Italian countryside or something like that.
Well, this reminds me of years ago when I had a particular corporate job that I didn't care for, and a friend of mine that I was talking about is like, but yeah, as a writer, isn't it good to kind of have a job you hate for a little bit? and I kind of thought, I was like, I suppose for a little bit it probably is, you know, because it kind of clarifies it kind of clarifies your perspective on like modernity or whatever. It allows you to kind of focus it and sort of say, this is what, you know, sort of this is what's wrong. This is what I don't like, you know. So he kind of had a point. I just,
you know, what you're like resisting for the rest of your life.
right. Yeah, exactly. So one thing I definitely want to spend some time talking about, you fairly recently in City Journal had this article on Gustave Flaubert, the Herald of Modernism, I believe is the title of it, or just Herald of Modernism. And I was so glad to see it because I feel like Flaubert does not get talked about enough in sort of, I guess, the sort of online space that I operate in. You know, talking to people about books and encountering people talking about books, he seems, and maybe I'm wrong, he seems sort of largely forgotten in that space. So I was excited to see that article, and I was delighted by how good it was and how many sort of surprising twists and turns and kind of things that I didn't know. You know, I've only really read Madame Bovary, but I've read it at least 2 times, and I think 3 times, and Temptation of St. Anthony, which is just this bizarre artifact. It's like, I feel like, it feels like something like an archaeologist found and was like, we don't really know what this is, but here it is.
Yes, it is. It's a very strange work. But I thought you've read Salambo as well, right? Because I think you talked about it on Art of Darkness.
You know, I have read Salambo. Yeah, now that you mention it.
Yeah.
Yes. That was and I think what happened with me with Salambo and why I don't even think about it that much is I think it was the first one, first Flaubert I read, and I don't know that I really knew what to do with it at the time, if that makes sense.
It's sort of like, it's kind of like a strange monster. Yeah,
and then after Madame Bovary, I can start to make some sense of this stuff. But I kind of start in a. I like sometimes just asking the stupid question, and why Flaubert? Like, this stuff's written in the he died in 1876, is that right?
Something, 1880 actually.
Okay. Oh yeah, I think Last Temptation maybe came out in 1876. Anyway, why Flaubert? why bother?
You mean like why bother as a reader, or why did I choose him to write an essay about?
Well, I guess those are 2 good questions. Let's start with why did you choose him?
Yeah, so for me, I think, like the title of my essay calls him, he is the herald of modernism. And that makes him not just an innovator, but a kind of very interesting bridge figure. And I'm interested in these moments of transition in world history, where an old age is kind of passing away and something new is coming. And I'm very interested in the figures that kind of stand in the gap and bring the new into presence and into our consciousness, which I guess maybe is like a pretentious way of saying it. But I mean, I think he really is kind of the herald of modernism. And so you could say, well, in what way is that true? Well, it's true in a few ways. His narrative approach, first, his style, and then something that I really like is his obsessive focus on the verbal surface of his work. This is something that, was not really a feature of many 19th century writers and becomes very much a feature of a lot of 20th and 21st century writers. So for the first, as a narrator, he takes himself out of his work. He doesn't comment on the action. He doesn't display moral judgment regarding the actions of his characters. And at the time, in the age of, writers like George Eliot, that was actually quite radical. In fact, it was so radical that you probably know his first novel, Madame Bovary, was put on trial for supposedly being immoral, for immorality, because Flaubert, in the context of the novel, never overtly condemns her actions. She's cheating on her husband, right. She's, taking poison. I mean, spoilers, right? But like, he never says, look at this fallen woman doing bad things.
Like,
or
it would have been okay if he would
he
have been wagging a finger at her the whole time. Then it would have been okay.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's weird.
Right, and so, something I mentioned in the essay, which I find, kind of a sign of how normies tend to misunderstand geniuses and their works, is that on the one side, you had people condemning the book, putting it on trial for immorality, and then it was successfully defended. Flaubert, succeeded or prevailed in the trial. But how did he prevail? Well, they successfully argued that the book was like a moral object lesson. It was a moral caution for young women, who might be tempted to go astray in this way. And it's like, that's not why Flaubert wrote it. And he knew that's not why he wrote it. It was written as a work of art. Mm-hmm. And so on one side, people could see it only as like this, work of immorality. And then on the other side, people were defending it as just a cautionary tale that was supposed to be a thing of moral improvement, for its readers. And really, that's not what it's about. So anyway, in terms of style, the second thing, Flaubert, he weaves in and out of multiple tenses in the course of the narrative, these like various forms of past and present tense, which you could maybe think of cinematically as like different focal lengths, creating more or less distance from the action. And then he almost single-handedly invents something that becomes so crucial for modern writers, which is what we call free indirect discourse, as a way to put readers in the minds of the characters. So what's interesting is that he steps back from the work while also, in a sense, bringing readers deeper into it than ever before. And the famous quote is that Flaubert said, "An author in his book must be like God in the universe, present everywhere and visible nowhere." So the overall effect is a kind of dispassionate intensity, if I can say that.
Oh, I love that. No,
and then I guess a few words. Sorry about the verbal surface thing that I said. Yeah, so Flaubert, I mean, and maybe this is what you're about to ask, but Flaubert is like famous for his precision, right? For pursuing le mot juste, the right word. And he could spend days just like reworking a single paragraph, or spend several weeks on a few dozen pages. But it's not just his precision or obsessive focus on the right word that's remarkable. It's also the rhythm of the prose, right? There's anyway. So I could say more, but I'll let you interject.
That's a great start, and I love all that. It's interesting. I came across. I don't even know. I had it screenshotted at one point. Just recently, somebody, I believe it was on Substack, was kind of saying what was wrong with sort of modern literature, modern writing. And one of the things was the primacy of free indirect discourse. And I just thought, I don't know, man. Like, to me, and I'd like your opinion on this, to me, like, the sort of discovery or innovation of that is like on the lines of discovering linear perspective in visual art. It's like changes the game entirely, in my opinion.
Oh yeah.
I feel like, and not that, I mean, sure, a great piece of work could be written that without it, I'm sure, but it just seems, I can't understand how that could be part of the problem with with books these days. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, once you start, I saw an opinion recently that apparently young people today have trouble reading the third person, right. Like novels set in the third person where there might be a large cast of characters and you spend time now in this one person's perspective and now in another. I don't know if this is true or not, but what I read was they call it head hopping and they don't like it. They want this like singular and I guess first person perspective because, and I don't know, this is probably not good for like what is already a very narcissistic age we live in, right? Mm-hmm. But that might be why yeah, people are attacking free and direct discourse. They're attacking the third person. I mean, what's going to be left at the end of all of this? You know?
Well, yeah. You get to a point like, you guys know what a book is? Like, we're not
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then it's like, sentences with more than one dependent clause. You know, can't have that. It's like we might as well just go back to hop on pop or something. Yeah. I don't know, but
and it's not that free and direct discourse. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've just been trained to read it and write in it. It doesn't seem to me to be particularly difficult. I mean, there are things that can make a book difficult to read for sure, and I've read passages that I've struggled with. It happens all the time. But it's basically never that problem. I don't know.
No, but what occurs to me that could be tripping some people up nowadays in the time of kind of cultural sensitivities we live in is a book that has an unlikable protagonist or narrator, or maybe not even the main character, but just an unlikable character, period. And free and direct discourse, especially for those who are not kind of well versed in what it's doing, this could be expressing unsavory thoughts and opinions or desires, emotions in a way that's not clearly bracketed in quotation marks, and also following the Flaubertian paradigm is not being overtly commented on by the narrator as like, now of course we know what he just thought was racist, now of course we know it's not acceptable to have those desires that he just expressed in his head, but free and direct discourse instead, you could think of it as making the reader sort of complicit with the thoughts of the character and pulling them into the head of that character. And some people may find that unpleasant if they are, I don't know, triggered by what's happening in the narrative.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. I mean, that falls into the category of, part of the point of all this stuff, as cliche as it is to just disturb the comfortable, right? I mean, if you're, you should at least occasionally in a novel have a feeling you don't like. But maybe that's just my bias.
Well, and we writers can be kind of unsavory characters ourselves, or at least we have a dark side or a shadow side that one of the reasons for artistic expression is to kind of, work through that or find a healthy, beneficial outlet for it. And so, I mean, the idea that like you would have to eliminate all of that from your work is kind of absurd. It's like half the reason that people in the past were writing what they wrote was to kind of get out that stuff that it may be like you might have a thought that many people have had for all of human history. It's not a great thought. It's not a thought you should act on, but it's something that has been a kind of universal experience. And what is art for if it's not to connect us through not merely the positive, but also, our shadow sides.
Oh,
and maybe to reconcile us to them or let people know, hey, you aren't alone with having this dark side, other people have it too, and like it's okay to whatever. It's part of being human.
Absolutely.
But this, to get back to Flaubert for a second, I think because we're talking about these different techniques, and so one of the things that's interesting is like there are different ways to be a wordsmith, right? So Proust actually criticized Flaubert. He felt that in all of Flaubert, there was scarcely one beautiful metaphor. That's what he said. Now, of course, this was an author in the next century making a rival claim to French letters, right?
Right.
And Proust's work is loaded with beautiful, astonishing metaphors. Like, that is his own special genius. So he's being a little sniffy there. But he was fair enough to say that even without memorable metaphors, Flaubert's manipulation of tenses and the rhythm of his sentences creates this remarkable flow. He called it like a moving pavement. And it's true. I mean, you've said you've read Madame Bovary like 3 times. It's highly readable.
It is,
you know, even
yeah.
in English translation, it's practically a page turner.
It is.
Which is, I think that really cuts against maybe the idea that a lot of people on, like, you know, lit Twitter or whatever have of it as just like an old, dusty kind of 19th century novel.
Well, yeah, no, and that's I think part of the this almost like deceptive sophistication of it. It's one of those things, and you know, Flaubert is not alone in this, and you could go into any art form or discipline and find figures like this, where if you dislocate them, like, let's say you didn't know anything about Flaubert and you were given this, but you didn't even know the title, and you just read it on an airplane or something. I think a insightful reader would still really enjoy it and get a lot out of it, but I think for me anyway, part of the, and it's a fairly small part, but part of the excitement of reading it is sort of realizing that he's just cutting through new brush into a new part of the map as he's writing this book, and you don't really realize that, because so much of the stuff you've read after him is directly or indirectly influenced by it, and so that the accomplishment can be kind of hidden unless you sort of understand that context, you know. And I think the other thing for me, what's so interesting about it too, it's a book that Madame Bovary in particular, I have to say, you know, and this is my sort of bias and taste, if I'd never heard of it before and you were just to give me a very basic, you know, Wikipedia 4-sentence summary, I don't think I'd be into it. I'd be like, I'll read something else.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not...
There's so many books like that.
Right. It's, okay, this woman, she's thinking about, you know, her marriage, you know, whatever. I don't... But, you know, you start... Yeah, and like you said, there's so many other books like that, and there's a way you can describe, I guess, any book to make it uninteresting. But, yeah, and yet you read through it, and it's just this marvel. It's really an amazing piece of work. I definitely, and even more, it's one of those things, and tell me what you think about this. I mean, it's one of those things, I think, for people who are interested in writing, that I think is kind of critical. You know, definitely read it for its place in literary history, read it for just how freaking good it is. But also, I think as a writer, there's a lot of, you can just you can literally watch the modernist turn happen between the pages, you know, in this one book effectively, and understand kind of what that means sort of cognitively, psychologically, stylistically. I do sometimes wonder what I'm missing in reading it in translation versus reading it in the French, but alas, I've only got this one lifetime. I'm probably not learning French by the end of it.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, look, you're right that, so time, as I say in the essay, has dulled our perception of Flaubert's radical project. You know, it's the formal elements of it have been so thoroughly assimilated as like to pass without comment. You know, it's kind of like reading some of Hemingway now, and of course Hemingway was heavily influenced by Flaubert, but you read, you know, some of Hemingway now, and you even though you go, wow, this is good, you can't recover the shock of the new that it must have had to be reading it in the 20s, and like he just cuts away so much that was a standard part of, you know, a short story or of a novel and so on. And, you know, it's not just his prose that's different, but his whole perspective, his kind of approach to it. And I mean, I think it's obvious, but it's worth saying that it's always harder to write a story where you're not just telling the story in an accepted mode, but you are inventing the mode at the same time through which you can tell your story. And that's what Flaubert was doing in Madame Bovary. You know, he was bushwhacking, as you said, like every step of the way, and it took him years because he had to invent the means by which he could tell that story. and also tell a good story at the same time. And I mean, that's really not it's not easy, to put it mildly. But like, I mean, I think maybe it would help to step back for a second and just sort of think about what the novel is as written by Flaubert. You know, he faced some criticism, actually, that his works lacked dramatic action. That's why you said, like, if you read the plot synopsis, you wouldn't be interested in it, right? But his reply to that was that ideas are action, which I think becomes a crucial insight for the modernist and postmodern writers, right? That the plot is not the only possible engine that can power a novel. But the important thing is that I wouldn't call Madame Bovary or Sentimental Education novels of ideas. Those ideas that Flaubert insisted on are conveyed through images and dramatic scenes, and those images, that drama, obviously are expressed in words. So what you have with the, you know, in a writer of the intense focus of Flaubert and the masterful craft, you have the textures and rhythm and complex music of the verbal alternately being used to depict both the vivid immediacy and the painterly distance of the pictorial, all in service of the intellectual, which is to say, you know, the symbolic or spiritual or metaphysical dimension. So it's ideas made flesh. There's an essay, one of my favorite, you know, literary scholars is Guy Davenport, and there's an essay of his in which he says he also wrote fiction, and he says that Davenport thinks of a page of prose as a picture, and he says that essentially it is a texture of images. And I think that was probably true for Flaubert. The words on the page had colors for him. They had textures. He didn't just want to get a word right, like the right word, le mot juste. He wanted to get all the words right. And by getting all the words right, he would achieve not just the bare meaning of his narrative in terms of plot and character, okay, Madame Bovary cuckolds her husband and this and that happens, or even in terms of the deeper symbolism, but like in terms of the picture that his prose made on the page. And that's another level from what most people, and especially most writers today, are thinking of. And then there's something else that Davenport says in that essay that I think applies. He says the text of a story is therefore a continuous graph. And so maybe that gets back to that idea of what Proust called like the moving pavement of Flaubert's style, you know, this continuous flow of images. And so I think Flaubert, just to kind of complete this thought, Flaubert was very cerebral, but maybe one reason why he was the one to innovate the non-judgmental narrator is that he doesn't think primarily in terms of moral lessons or concepts or ideas. He thinks in images, and images are the building blocks of his narratives.
Right. No, that's a really interesting point. It's like there's perhaps an argument that Flaubert's not that maybe he didn't do the moral judgment thing as a deliberate resistance or reaction to anything, but it's just sort of like that's not how his brain works. That's not how he sees the world. So that's not how he's going to see his writing. That's not what. Right. That's not what's salient to him in terms of what makes something worth reading or worth writing. That's really interesting. No, I love all this. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the book Madame Bovary has meant so much to me as a writer, as a sort of a not obviously as a sort of guide how to write or something like that, but definitely as this sort of example of like, oh, this I love the flowing pavement. Is that what Proust said?
The moving pavement.
Moving pavement. I absolutely love that. The implication that there's this like firmness and solidity and implacability to it, right. And yet it's at the same time. I absolutely love that.
Well, for Proust, it was like a backhanded compliment because he describes this kind of monotonous quality that like Flaubert has. Again, it's not, you know, his writing isn't punctuated with these astonishing metaphors and so on, and yet somehow it like pulls you along. And, you know, so by calling it not a moving river, let's say, but a moving pavement, he means to imply perhaps a certain grayness or monotony as he saw it. Right. And yet also he's paying homage to the power of Flaubert's narratives.
Well, leave it to Proust to write a sort of multivalent metaphor, right? In all cases, at all times. Yeah. Right. You know, there's another. There's another sort of aspect of Flaubert that I think is worth thinking about, and this is sort of off the page, or perhaps in his correspondence. There are these sort of pithy quotes that float around. And one of them that I took very seriously at some point as a writer, and I'm curious if this is sort of true for you, and maybe this can lead into thinking about what we can learn from sort of day to day as in our writing sense. This what is it? I've heard different translations of this, but it's basically be disciplined and orderly in your life so you can be violent and original in your work. And I wonder, does that resonate for you? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I think that does make sense. Oftentimes the people that are like, wearing the proverbial beret or whatever are kind of the posers. They're not often the really original writers. Flaubert lived a paradoxical life. I mean, no two ways about it. Like, in some ways, he was incredibly regimented. He never married. He never had children. He read. He wrote constantly. Did tons of research. He did spend some time traveling abroad. Not unlike Murnane, but that was even partly for research. And then he had some. His life intersected with some major kind of cataclysmic events, like during the Franco-Prussian War, he was dispossessed for a while because his ancestral home in the French countryside had Prussian soldiers quartered on it, so that forced him to move out temporarily. But in his work, he was what we call a stylist, but we tend to think of that as meaning like someone who just writes tricky fancy prose, right? Prose that calls attention to itself. But Flaubert said that style underlies words as much as it is embodied in them. It is as much the soul of a work as it is the flesh. And so he, on the one hand, his life was kind of paradoxical. On the other hand, he insists on this harmony or unity where he refused to divide form and substance, the sound and sense. He didn't just want to get his basic meaning across in a sentence. All the notes had to be pitched at the right, in the right register and so on. And the work had to be really totally unified. And so, as I say in the essay, it was only through ascetic habits that he could enjoy the voluptuous delights of his writing table. And so in his work, he was kind of insisted on this total unity, and but if you look at the work and the life, it was definitely kind of bifurcated in that way.
Yeah, amen. No, I love that. It got me thinking, and this isn't something that I had really been thinking about in preparation for this, but it's something that, I've brought up on this podcast before, and something I think about from time to time. We're in this curious place sort of in the history of literature where, as a art form, we're in competition even more so with other art forms than we have in the past, right? Not only 100 years ago we were starting to compete with cinema, but now it's cinema plus TV plus streaming plus scrolling plus the omnipresent availability of everything, and that's pretty cool in a lot of ways. But I persistently am thinking about podcasts, right? I know. I'm like, you're listening to this and you're not reading.
You're part of the problem.
I am part of the problem, Brad. But I like to think we get one person out there to read Madame Bovary, and maybe it's all worth it.
Yeah, right.
But I start to think this sort of Flaubert's approach and his perspective on sort of what a piece of prose, a piece of fiction ought to be. It does make me think, like, partly what he's doing, and maybe not consciously, maybe this is just what we can take away from it as a sort of a 21st century audience, is it helps you understand what is the thing that really only prose writing can do, right? So cinema is capable of all kinds of cool stuff, and I like a great movie as much as the next person, but there are things it can't do, and I think a work like Flaubert shows us what is the thing that is, particular to prose fiction. And I kind of wonder if, if that's how literature sort of survives into the future and remains salient into the future, is by leaning into what only it can do, and sort of eschewing there's so much stuff you can read now that it's like, this seems like you just didn't have the budget to make a movie, is what this book reads like. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And I kind of wonder if you can take Flaubert as a model of, like, write a book, a novel, and it not that you couldn't make it into a film and do a creative adaptation, but just like maybe the goal is to make a thing that can only be a book. I don't know.
No, I'm kind of right there with you.
Yeah.
I've been thinking that for a long time, that these books that look like it's just really an intermediate form or a stepping stone waiting for the Netflix adaptation or something, that, I just don't see the value of that. You let the screenplay writers do their thing. And I mean, yeah, lots of great movies, some of the best have been adapted from novels and so on. But, I think in generations past, the novelists were not writing their novels with an eye toward adaptation, and now I think with a lot of kind of mainstream slop, it's pretty clear that is what's going on,
right,
and what they're hoping for. And I mean, Flaubert spent 7 years writing sentimental education. Most novelists today would say, or even nonfiction writers, why spend 7 years on one book when in that time I could get 3 bites at the apple?
Right.
Now those 3 books might all be forgettable and we wouldn't be talking about them 150 years later, but who cares? I'll make mine, in the meantime, and I'll get my Netflix deal and my whatever else. I think that prose, I'm really a big believer in this. There are moods in which I would make even more extreme statements than yours, about, cinema versus, literary prose. And we have to remember that cinema is just a much younger art form. And by virtue of that, in part, and also by virtue of the constraints of the medium, there are just so many things it can't do, which literature can do. And literature in one form or another has been around for thousands of years and has built up a massive war chest of techniques. And, I mean, the English language is like this incredibly potent weapon at your disposal.
Yeah.
It is an entire orchestra, and you can play like a single violin with it, or you can have a huge brass section. I mean, just the possibilities are endless. But I think that it's kind of like the effect for me that AI is having on writing. The immediate effect is it's turning a lot of writing, even by humans, into stuff that sounds like AI written slop. It's kind of like the AI and the human are converging. But I think the stuff that will endure and continue to have value will be the stuff that in no way sounds like AI slop, that could not possibly be mistaken for AI writing. So I've actually found that as that AI style has become more prevalent on, social media and so on, I find that my writing in essays and fiction is actually getting more baroque. It's getting, a little more complex. Like maybe my sentences are a little longer, more semicolons, things like that. And it's not, I wasn't conscious of it initially as like I'm just going to do the opposite then,
right.
Some kind of stupid kind of snide reaction. But no, rather it's just that I think also as you get older, you just explore like more and more of the resources of your medium. And yeah, I do think that this is kind of a rambling answer, but I do think you're right that the work that will endure and that has value today in literature is going to be the stuff that has to exist as literature, that was conceived as literature and is meant to be received as literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. Yeah, no, this is we're 100%.
My rallying cry. Yeah.
No, we're 100%
So
on the
much.
same page, and I'm happy to hear you extol the sort of messy virtues of the English language as well, because I occasionally, somebody in my life will make like a disparaging comment about the English language because we have weird spelling conventions from time to time, and some of the grammar stuff isn't exactly logical.
They can miss me with that,
right? And to me, it's like, no, that's all. Do you understand? That's all surface area. That's all the zhuzh. That's what like makes it cool.
Right.
Is its ability to do that, and all of the stuff you can do with it. It's so exciting. Yeah, I mean, I don't.
Well, listen, no less a writer than Borges, who of course wrote all of his work in Spanish, but later in his life he actually learned Old English so that he could read some of that, literature in the original. He was completely enamored of English and is actually on record. You can find, clips of his interviews. And I think he mentions it also in his Paris Review interview. He talks about how English is incredible, partly because it has something that Spanish and these Romance languages don't have, which is this double register. So you can say kingly or you can say regal. And those two words mean roughly the same thing, but they are in two different registers. And basically this is because of the inheritance from Latin and from Anglo-Saxon. And so we have a lot of synonyms where one is clearly a good rough Anglo-Saxon word, and the other derives from Latin or maybe from Greek or maybe, from German. I mean, we've got words from French. Of course, we have loanwords from many languages, but they end up slotting into this kind of double or sometimes, triple register. And you can really play with that. You can write a work that's all in one register or all in another, right? And if you go back in history, like 17th, 18th century English writing has a lot of that Latinate register. You read like Samuel Johnson's essays, right? And it's all Latinate. But it's incredible English, but it's all in that kind of register, which to us is kind of difficult, right? But the real magical effects come when you're playing back and forth between the two of them and going back and forth between that line, across that line. And, to someone like Borges, who really felt the finer edges of words, or the way Flaubert did, words like kingly and regal are not actually the same word. Like, yes, the dictionary or whatever will list them as synonyms, but they actually have a completely different feel, if not even a different meaning, Amen. And or words like infinite, endless, eternal, these things that are similar, but really it would be a mistake to try to substitute one for the other in most cases. And as a writer, your job really is to just churn through this incredible word horde that we've inherited and make the most of it that you can.
Yeah, and that's what is the Flaubert's term for the right words?
Le mot juste.
Le mot juste. Yes. Okay. Yes. That's what you're trying to pick through. And I do distinctly remember seeing, I believe it was William F. Buckley of all people that was interviewing Borges on this.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I think that's
what
it was.
Firing Line.
Yeah.
And it was on the old show Firing Line.
Yeah. No, I saw that interview and it got me all fired up. The other thing that he talks about, and I'm not deep on any other languages other than English, to be honest. So I kind of, this is I can't verify this personally, but the other thing he talks about is I believe it's the prepositional flexibility of English, right? This idea that we can sort of live up to, live down, live through.
Up to something, right. Look down on, exactly.
Right, you just add that one, you slot in that one word, and you move that one word around, and suddenly you've got, a flowering of different meanings that are very similar in feel in some ways, but have very different meanings. So you combine that with the dual nature in there,
Yeah, just think about the different feel between, home, house, domicile, habitation, all of these different words. And people like Borges who had a certain facility in English, or someone like W.G. Seabolt, they ended up often kind of superintending the English translation. I actually don't know to what extent Borges was involved, but I think he had some involvement. I know, like Seabolt did, they kind of superintended the English translation of their works because maybe in their native language they had a much more limited range of words that they could use for when they want to say a room or a house or something. There's an expected word in Spanish that you would use every time, but in the English translation they might go, but here I would really like that to be translated domicile, and here I would really like, or instead of room, could you say chamber here, or could you say compartment, or something like that. And English to me is anyone, they can fight me, anyone who wants to criticize the English languages. I think they don't know how to appreciate what they have.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And then there's a certain sense which it's you don't get to have the power without having the mess to a certain extent.
Right.
I think.
Absolutely.
The two end up going kind of hand in hand. Absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Temptation of St. Anthony, if we could. I have a copy of it here, and it's such a even the cover. I don't actually. I'm curious which painting that is, because there's also the interesting thing about, well, not the interesting thing, an interesting thing about this book is artwork basically titled "The Temptation of Saint Anthony," and having the temptation of Saint Anthony as a subject is practically a genre unto itself. I mean, all of the old masters took a crack at it, right? And so there's something very interesting about Flaubert writing this book. I mean, you talk about him seeing the page or thinking of the page as in images visually. There's something kind of interesting to me about Flaubert sort of installing himself in this subgenre of painting with this crazy book. Would you be able to give me or give the audience like just a brief like what the heck is this thing, and then maybe we can kind of get into some aspects of it?
Sure, yeah. So basically, The Temptation of St. Anthony Flaubert is it's a long work dramatizing the 4th century saints' mental fight against a host of Christian heresies, pagan doctrines, and fleshly sins. And it is a very phantasmagoric, hallucinatory kind of work, as you can imagine, because this is all ostensibly mental phenomena or kind of like religious visionary phenomena which he's experiencing. And it was actually written before Madame Bovary in a much longer version that Flaubert made a couple of his close friends suffer through. He read it out loud to them, and it was I think they listened to it for like 32 hours. Wow. So if you think I've like, some of my if you think I've rambled on a bit at times during this podcast, just imagine they listened to him read this for 32 hours, and at the end one of his closest friends said, "We think you should throw it into the fire and never speak of it again." So yeah. So
you wonder if he would have just read
from that.
You wonder if he would have just read like 5 pages if they would have had a different opinion. Because I feel like if you forced me to listen to that, it doesn't matter what it is. After 32 hours, I'm going to be like, just no.
It could be War and Peace. It could be Moby Dick, and you would be like, I have stuff to do. Right. What are you doing to me, man? Yeah. No, it could be. But so he didn't end up publishing it for decades, and in a much, much shorter revised version. Some of a lot of the original schema I think remained the same, but a lot of stuff was cut from it. A lot of stuff was revised or rewritten, and he was already a very established author by the time it was eventually published. Early on, in school, like he was reading the French Romantics, he was reading Victor Hugo. He said at one point that it was like there was a stained glass window between him and the world, and so you can imagine this kind of the exotic coloring of his imagination at that time. He wanted to reach like far back into the past to this, very colorful episode and even a salacious episode, because of course Saint Anthony is tempted in the flesh by like naked women and all of these things, and so it was maybe the religious aspect of it made it a kind of acceptable subject in 19th century France, but for a writer like Flaubert it would have seemed like a space of unbounded freedom where he could just let his imagination run wild.
Yeah. No, there's a in my edition has an introduction by Michel Foucault, who I have mixed feelings about, but it's a really good introduction. And the one thing he says about temptation that I think is really interesting. Well, I got a couple things that he says about it that I think are pretty interesting. One is he says, quote, "We have learned as readers that the temptation is not the product of dreams or raptures, but a monument to meticulous erudition." And I think the reading experience is one of somewhat more on the dreams and raptures side. As you're reading through, it does feel a little bit like a Bruegel painting or a Bosch painting, where it's just sort of like phantasmagoric and crazy and a little bit hallucinatory and like frankly, for me, it's one of the closest reading experiences to like a psychedelic experience, because it's tremendously destabilizing all the way throughout. It sort of never lets you get a foothold. I shouldn't say it never does, but it always feels like, it feels like in a way you're sort of I don't want to say you're undergoing the sort of same temptation, but you can imagine if, the temptation of St. Anthony was a sort of a real thing that happened, this sort of disorientation of all of it on top of the sort of terror and the torture. I feel like reading this book is a little bit like that. And some of it is kind of the line by line reading, but some of it is also just sort of the structure. I mean, it sort of moves between these different modes that is also kind of delightfully, I almost said confusing, and maybe confusing is part of it, but there is a sort of delightful nature in which it feels like you're going to get into the next chapter, and I don't know if it's going to be an opera, or it's going to be I don't know what. I never know what's going to happen in the next section, which is.
Yeah, no, it's a kind of for as expansive as the visions are, or as wild as it can get, it is a kind of claustrophobic reading experience at times, because the entire thing takes place from within the point of view of St. Anthony, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so, you're being exposed to all of these visions and so on, and this stuff is just being thrown at you in an onslaught. And it's not as if you're reading a story about a guy who's experiencing an onslaught of visions. No, you are experiencing the onslaught of visions with him, or in his stead almost, in reading this dramatic work. And Baudelaire read some early extracts of St. Anthony, and he called it the secret chamber of Flaubert's mind, which I think is really interesting, because mainstream critics and the literary canonizers down through the decades have tended to prize Flaubert's realist novels far above the other work. So why might it be that Flaubert would see St. Anthony as the secret chamber of Flaubert's mind? Partly, like I suggested, in his early years, he always had this other side to him where he was drawn to, the exotic East, and he was, he deeply researched all these different world religions and ancient customs and ancient civilizations to as much as was possible in the 19th century. And in a lot of ways, Flaubert was actually working against the grain of his own deepest passions to write Madame Bovary. He had a lot of antipathy for bourgeois life. And so St. Anthony was much closer to his heart. And I think it's funny that I feel like Flaubert gives us a good reason, if we needed one, for believing that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, and that maybe a singular person called Homer composed both the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Because if Flaubert had lived 2,000 years ago, I have no doubt that historians would refuse to believe that the same person had written both Madame Bovary and The Temptation of St. Anthony, or Sentimental Education and Salammbô.
It's difficult. I do kind of have to rack my brain to think of somebody who's had that kind of range. Gosh, especially in that time, sort of especially before the capital M real modernist turn takes place. I know you can now have, J.G. Ballard would be somebody who's kind of done something like that or whatever, but I struggle to think of somebody who would write Madame Bovary and then also it not being, as you very well pointed out, it not being this sort of evolution where it's like, well, I started out doing realist stuff and then over time I got weirder and weirder. It's like the weird stuff and the realism
went back and forth.
Yeah, it was happening simultaneously. It's just two different notes that he was able to play both at the top level. It's really something.
So he writes the early version of St. Anthony first, then Madame Bovary, then he escapes completely from the dreary, bourgeois milieu to write a novel, this epic of ancient Carthage, which is Salammbô, and it's very grotesque. There are scenes of, crucifixion and child sacrifice and stuff. Very colorful, to put it mildly. But then he goes and spends 7 years writing Sentimental Education, which draws in part on his early years as a law student, which he gave up because of health reasons and because he hated it. But he was having attacks of epilepsy while cramming for exams and stuff. And so his father kind of relented. He had been insisting that Flaubert study law, and he kind of relented. And from then on, Flaubert was able to pursue literature. But, so he did Sentimental Education, and then revises Temptation of St. Anthony, and then he wrote some other stuff later. He went back and forth, and I think you can come up with examples of writers who have written lots of different kinds of things, but you would really struggle to find an example of an author who, as you said, did it at kind of the very high level and was so influential, not just in one but in both, and who kind of went back and forth across that divide throughout his writing career.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you know,
like,
this dual strain of Flaubert's influence is really interesting. Maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, it's no, because I just thought of another sort of example of Knausgaard, you know, his work My Struggle, and I haven't read his more recent couple of novels, but to my understanding, they definitely sort of take flight into the more imaginative realms. And as we know, anybody's listening to this show knows that My Struggle is sort of the in my opinion, sort of the top shelf auto fiction, and it's kind of lonely up there for the most part.
Fiction,
yeah. And
yeah, lonely. Yeah.
But you know, that's an evolution. It's sort of like he writes My Struggle. He gets, you know, for lack of a better term, he sort of gets that out of his system, and now he can write about angels and whatever it is he's doing now. And I don't mean to dismiss it. I'm looking forward to getting to those books eventually. Whereas, yeah, Flaubert is it's like he's playing all of the instruments. It's a very different thing.
Yeah, I mean, so like during his lifetime, George Sand, the fellow novelist, said that he had two publics. Oh, you okay? That's all right. Yeah, but so like one public was for his kind of naturalistic novels, and the other was for his works of historical fiction and religious fantasy. And this influence really has come down to us in that dual or divided way. So on one side you have, you know, Woody Allen in Manhattan listing sentimental education as one of the things that make life worth living. You know, that's one line of Flaubert's influence. He probably wouldn't give a shit about, the Temptation of St. Anthony. And so that strain of his influence shows up everywhere in the canon, you know, from Hemingway on down. But on the other side, and Emile Zola, of course, and others. But on the other side, you have this weird and phantasmagoric stuff, which influenced, and it's a stated influence on Lovecraft and Fritz, Leiber, and these other early fabulist writers. So it's definitely interesting the way it has kind of divided like that.
Yeah,
and it's almost like never the twain shall meet. Like, I think these, Lovecraft was not talking to the people that were influenced by Madame Bovary, and the people who knew Flaubert as the author of Madame Bovary were not, reading sword and sorcery stuff that was inspired by this other side of his, body of work.
Right. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I had never, until I read your article, I had never thought of the sword and sorcery sort of stuff as coming from, or at least being, having some Flaubert in its DNA, which makes total sense and is absolutely fascinating. I'd like to spend some time in the kind of Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith thing for a minute. I mean,
sure.
I definitely think of. I tried to find sort of perfect passages to compare, and the trick with reading a passage out of The Temptation of St. Anthony is, well, what is the trick of it exactly? It's hard to find like one bit that just sort of works on its own without like some context around it and explains but I think you can find these sections in Temptation of St. Anthony that feel, I should say that the other way around. There are occasionally these moments in Lovecraft that where I personally don't think they're sort of as finely tuned as Flaubert. I can see the searching for coming up with sort of the perfect phrase to catch this thing. I think Lovecraft kind of suffers from. I don't know what it is. He like runs out of steam looking for the right word, so he just decides to call something scary. Basically.
Eldritch.
Yeah, it's just like I don't know what it is. We'll just call it Eldritch, I guess, and we'll move on. So there's something about he doesn't necessarily. He's not going to spend 7 years trying to create the perfect thing. It would have been interesting to see Lovecraft try to do that. But what do you like? Do you see? I mean, I guess I'm presuming that you're reasonably well read on Lovecraft. Maybe that's not exactly your speed, but. What do you see as a connection between those two?
Well, so Lovecraft, what he liked in Flaubert, which again is he's obviously not talking about Madame Bovary
Right.
and that side of his work. He praised Flaubert's orgies of poetic fantasy.
Right.
And I think if you read Salammbô, like there's some literal kind of orgiastic scenes. So there's this long horrible sequence in which the bronze statue of the god Moloch is just like having children fed into its gaping maw, and like the flames are burning hotter and hotter, and they're just like throwing in more and more people. And yeah, that there's a certain maybe if Lovecraft had written that, it would turn out that Moloch was like an elder god or
Right,
something,
right.
or like he was one face of some great old one that was being worshipped in the time in the great before time or something. I definitely think that there are some commonalities there. It's not that Lovecraft took settings from Flaubert or took maybe his obsessive, focus on finding the right word and so on. I think it was more that like exotic coloring of his imagination, and maybe he saw in Flaubert a figure who was inspirational because he let his imagination run riot in those ways. I mean, who in the 19th century was writing scenes of, child sacrifice and things like that? Who was, writing these? And the thing, Flaubert, because he was Flaubert, he didn't just kind of go off half-cocked and, invent like a fake historical period to set his writing in or something. No, he did all of this deep research to try to nail down the setting of ancient Carthage, and I mean, he really suffered. There's a really colorful quote. I mean, it's almost a shame that like in his letters he's able to be far more unbounded in his expression than he could be in print, at that time in history. But like when he's doing the siege of Carthage, he's working on that scene. He writes to one of his correspondents, "War machines are sawing my back in half. I'm sweating blood, pissing boiling water, shitting catapults, and farting slingman's stones." And, he's just
great.
like, it's like you can hear the two sides of that. On one hand, he's saying, I'm really suffering with this labor of love that I'm doing. On the other half, he's kind of boasting and bragging about the epic scale of it.
Right.
Everything he's throwing in there. He says, I've succeeded in introducing into the same chapter a shower of shit and a procession of pederasts. I've stopped there. Am I being too sober? Like, should I go farther?
Right.
And so I think that's the kind of thing that Lovecraft was like, oh my God, there's really no boundaries here. Like, we can just push the envelope as far as we want. And I'm only speculating in a sense, and based on the little bit that Lovecraft put into print about the influence that Flaubert had on him. But yeah, that's what I would say.
That sounds definitely right to me. Again, from this Foucault intro to the Temptation, Foucault says that credits Flaubert with what does he say here? The activation of modern literature, which I like that term, activation. Like we're turning something on.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can now we can do this. And I think,
right.
And Foucault draws a direct line to the likes of Joyce, Kafka, Borges, which I think is all there. But I'm very interested in this connection to the likes of H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and sort of the Weird Tales crew, because I'm of the opinion that the Weird Tales move, despite the how crude some of it is, and how sort of like you can tell you were getting paid by the word to a certain degree.
Yeah,
there's a generativity and a vision to enough of it that it feels like this strange. It feels like this like schizophrenic American cousin to the to like the modernist turn, right? Like it's got kind of its own thing, but it's almost like if there's some sort of psychological transformation happening in society that the Weird Tales is like one permutation of it, and Joyce is another permutation of it, and Hemingway's another permutation of it. So it's kind of cool to see Flaubert as being sort of setting the table for both of them in a certain way. Not to, not that all the Weird Tales guys were just like you said, that they weren't inspired so much by Bovary as they were by Salambo and Temptation, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, it's almost like there was something Baroque kind of happening on both sides. So while the modernists were, delving into the psychological depths and kind of following, Freud and Jung and some of these discoveries or inventions, whatever you want to call them, but these ideas of the unconscious or subconscious mind, the Weird Tales writers were kind of creating a more Baroque surface, right? So they weren't like in the Conan the Cimmerian stories by Robert E. Howard, or, Fritz Leiber's Sword and Sorcery, or Lovecraft. It's not so much about the psychological depth, but the surface world that the characters inhabit becomes very rich and complex in the florabundant language that's used to describe these things, whether it be these kind of treasure chambers that Conan is exploring, full of gold and porphyry columns and marble and this and that, and onyx and jade, and or whether it be Lovecraft. The other thing that they do is that while the modernists were kind of delving into the psychological depths, the weird writers were exploring deep time. That was like that's the thing that I think one of the major things that has given the Lovecraft mythos so much staying power is this terrifying sense of the abysses of time that it opens up in the reader's mind. Whether it be like these prehistoric civilizations that existed unsuspected in Antarctica or wherever else before maybe men even walked the earth, or whether it be even before the earth itself existed and there's like some mad god dancing at the heart of the universe or whatever, these great old ones like circling the mountain tops of a young and cooling earth. Like, these are all, I mean, listen, you can probably tell from the descriptions, like, yes, when I was 15, I devoured Lovecraft. I was reading all of that stuff, and I think there is an age for Flaubert too, when he was young, like I said, there's an age where that kind of surface coloring is very appealing. Like, it really fires your imagination, and maybe later you want some greater like emotional depth, maturity of, psychological insight. And that's when you read Madame Bovary, not once, but twice, but 3 times, right, etc. Or maybe you write a novel yourself like that. But at the time, like, I moved on from Lovecraft to the writers of this movement called the New Weird in the early 2000s, which were, all these writers were very consciously looking back to the Weird Tales writers of, the 30s, and they called themselves the New Weird because they, in the same way we're kind of talking about maybe trying to find a bridge between the modernists and like the Weird Tales writers in the 20th century, the New Weird writers like China Miéville, for instance, or K.J. Bishop, or Jeff Vandermeer, who has gone on to like, quite a successful career. One of his films was adapted into a Natalie Portman movie. But these writers did not want to be sort of ghettoized into science fiction or fantasy, high fantasy, urban fantasy, horror, or any of these other like subdivisions of the speculative fiction genre that had been created. They wanted to have this more holistic thing because they looked back to their kind of predecessors and they said, well, wait a minute, Lovecraft's work, he has his like fantastical dreamlike stuff, but he has his elements of horror. He has elements of science fiction with, space aliens in some of his stories. He has, fantasy, etc. And why do we need to kind of separate and compartmentalize all of this stuff? And so, I was reading at the time, I was like deeply into China Miéville's Baslag novels like Perdido Street Station, The Scar, Iron Council. But I was also reading Borges and Kafka and more traditional modernists like Fitzgerald. And these for me did not seem like so far apart. There were I don't know if I would say exactly commonalities, but certainly in some way they were like both lighting up my brain. And this gets into maybe the deep lore of the early internet, but in the early 2000s, there were some websites that kind of also didn't separate between this stuff. So one was called The Modern Word that I used to visit, and the focus was on authors in the high modernist, kind of postmodern and speculative traditions. So people like Borges, who, Borges has stories about like infinite libraries, endless books, a cursed token, what is it called? The Zahir or something,
I love the Zahir. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, incredible story. And like, if he had written in a later generation, that might have been ghettoized in like a science fiction or fantasy magazine, right? But instead, he's been taken up into the literary canon.
Yeah, just by the way, not to totally throw you off, Borges loved Lovecraft.
No. Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's right.
He has a story, I can't remember what the name of it, but he has a story that's based...
Well, it's like how the French symbolists loved Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
More even than like American writers. Like the French give Poe credit for being a better writer even than most people in the U.S. do.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So there is these interesting these interesting sort of crossovers.
So I was going to say, so people like Borges, like Calvino is another one. Kafka, of course, Thomas Pynchon, Umberto Eco. These people that were, Umberto Eco has novels that are like historical fiction, but also fantasy elements, but also, kind of set in the real world. So that was my first introduction to a lot of great stuff. And it was during this, what I still think of as this magic window of time, when people whose minds had been formed by print culture were given free reign in this new unbounded space called the internet. So you got these like long, thoughtful, highly crafted essays on these authors, and the website ran a contest for submissions of literary quotes to feature on its homepage. And when I was a teenager in like 2002, I actually won the contest once. And my prize was a hardcover copy of William Gaddis's final novel, Agape Agape, which I still own. And so that gives you an idea of like the kind of authors the site focused on. But it was like these difficult authors of every stripe, basically, from Joyce on to, speculative fiction. And most of all, I think the ones who really straddled the line. And so like, it's interesting to me how people like Kafka, Borges, Calvino have been embraced by the literary canon, but they've also been foundational for these weird fiction writers who maybe themselves like get short shrift from the academy.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, that's so great. And
in fairness, I do think we should say there's an element of literary quality, right? Like Borges has been taken up into the academy partly because he was a truly phenomenal universal sort of author. And admittedly, many people just writing like speculative fiction are not of that caliber. And so maybe they don't deserve the same kind of attention from the academy.
Sure.
But nevertheless.
But Borges is a sort of an instance in which it does show you that there is a way that you can write about basically anything, and if it achieves a particular level of quality or innovation, that there is a space for it in the canon. Because the Borges short stories are... There's a wide range of... Some of them are the weirdest thing you'll ever read,
Right.
So, And
he's another author like Flaubert who was not just writing a story, but inventing the form in which his story could be written. So many of his most famous stories dispense with almost all of the traditional elements of a short story.
Yeah.
And yet somehow they are among, the most incredible things you can get your hands on.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's something odd. I spent a lot of time at universities in writing classes and workshops and plays. You're reading a short story and you come in with, you're supposed to have opinions about it, and and nobody ever in any one of those classes set a Borges short story in front of me. And in retrospect, I find that absolutely fascinating and slightly galling. To be honest,
yeah,
you know what I mean. It's just like never once, like nobody ever. Yeah. And since then, I kind of found it on my own, obviously. But like, if you're trying to teach, if you're trying to help people, young people, learn how to write short stories in particular, because that's the sort of the workshop form, the workshop medium. It's like, man, you'd think someplace in the quiver would be a Borges short story, but apparently not.
Yeah, you can only read so much Raymond Carver,
Right, yeah, and Raymond Carver's great, but like, there are other colors on the palette,
Well, that's the thing, because it's not just teaching these students how to write. It's really, in the course of one semester or even 2 years, you can't necessarily teach them how to write. But what you can do is suggest the range of possibilities for what can be written. And reading a Borges short story will definitely do that.
Yes.
It will open your mind to the possibilities of the form, and so much else.
Yeah. Amen. So I'm going to take up a little bit more of your time. There's kind of a couple other places I want to go. I am starting to do this thing in these more conversational episodes where I sort of ask for some stuff out of your personal canon. Now, we've kind of already prepped this, and
Sure.
I kind of know what you're going to say, but
Sure.
what I think one of lay them on me. What are a couple books that are sort of in your personal
sure.
canon that we? Yeah.
If I can be a jerk here for a second, and can I stick with Flaubert for just a second?
Absolutely.
Because
Please do.
it just occurred to me there was something about, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention just a little bit about his biography, because I think it does maybe help to shed light on a lot of the stuff we were talking about. You said something earlier about maybe the way he wrote, it wasn't in reaction against the older stuff. Maybe that was the way his brain was wired. And so it's true, Flaubert was not a polemical writer, and art for him, I think, was like he wanted to live in and through it. It was like a second life. He called it a second nature. But so in terms of his upbringing, the reasons for that might be not to psychoanalyze him or whatever, but his father was a surgeon, right? And the family lived in one wing of the hospital. So Flaubert, as a kid, and his sister actually, would climb the garden trellis and look down to see their father in the operating theater dissecting corpses. And he visited the morgue, he was taken by an uncle as a kid to see the local insane asylum. So he saw that ugly side of life very early on. And I think this ends up creating the two features of his work. First, the more exotic stuff we were talking about, he wanted art in his own life to be a bulwark against that. But at the same time, he was too honest not to use his art to depict those ugly realities, right? And to depict them without giving them a moral gloss, just presenting them like bodies on a slab, basically. If you think about, as a kid, being taken to an insane asylum and seeing some woman chained to the wall screaming, or seeing your father dissecting corpses, there's no moral context necessarily that is put around that. There's no framework of interpretation for you. You are just coming face to face with these just almost unassimilable experiences. Yeah, these nightmarish facts of life. And so I think part of him imaginatively wanted to retreat from that and live in a world of eternal beauty. When he writes the word art in his letters, he always spells it with a capital A. And so I think, he says, there's this great quote. He says, "What seems to me the highest and most difficult achievement of art is not to make us laugh or cry, nor to arouse our lust or rage, but to do what nature does, that is, to set us dreaming."
Yeah.
So I think there was very much a part of him that wanted to live in this dream world where he wouldn't have to, really face that other stuff. But then on the other side, he was the son of a surgeon, and he was pulled to that stuff, and he assimilated it at a very young age, and that comes through in his work. So anyway,
no, I love that.
I think that speaks to...
That's a great insight.
I think that speaks to both his method and his madness.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, that's going in the promo.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's
well, the Stoics. What is it they always say? The obstacle is the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I by the same token, maybe the method is the madness.
Yes,
How do you
exactly.
like that?
Now, see, you've just figured out the secret to the secret thesis to the show. So that's perfect.
There you go. I've uncovered.
Yeah.
I've said too much.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. That's a good
to be silenced.
That's a good Easter egg for people to stumble across.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry for that.
No, that's
kind
great.
of
That's great.
Semi-digression.
That was great stuff.
I
Absolutely.
felt like I needed to touch on that because I really, for anyone who's not going to read the essay or maybe won't even read that much of Flaubert, but is interested in the discussion we've been having, this maybe helps put a framework around where this stuff came from for him personally. We can talk about the historical development of the novel, and what role Flaubert played in that, who he, was inspired by as authors and who he influenced, which we've done. But I think it had like some deep stuff in his personal life that, that emerged as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's great stuff. That actually just that you've helped expand my understanding not only of Flaubert but of my own sort of relationship to the work. But that really sort of locks it in. I really appreciated that. But yeah, before we
Sure.
we got a couple other spots I want to go. Personal canon. What's in there?
Absolutely.
Give me a couple things from it.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna plug, I think, an author who is really like a kind of unsung minor master of 20th century American letters, and then I'm going to plug a novel which I do think is well regarded but isn't talked about enough. So the first is this author Alfred Hayes, who was a mid-century American novelist and screenwriter, and I think of him as like the missing link between Hemingway and James Salter. Actually, in his first novel, there's even a bullfighting scene, but it's in Mexico, not Spain, and it's fantastic, right? Yeah. So, but like, there's all these think pieces being written asking, like, where have all the literary men gone? Mm-hmm. Why aren't men reading novels anymore? Mm-hmm. And one reason, which I'm not the first to point out, is that, there really just aren't many novels being published now that are truly honest about the male psyche, especially the straight male psyche. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean war or macho stuff or, like, Tom Clancy novels. I mean male loneliness. I mean regret. Sexual obsession or sexual frustration, ambition and disappointment, the trials of aging, like all of that. And Hayes covers that terrain amazingly well. Another way I think of him as like a sort of Edward Hopper in prose. He was writing at the same time that Hopper was painting, and to me his novels feel like prose equivalents of Edward Hopper paintings.
I like that.
He wrote 3 worthwhile novels, My Face for the World to See, In Love, and The End of Me. And all of them are short. All of them are, what would you say, like emotional gut punches. And all of them have been reprinted by NYRB Classics. So definitely you should run out and buy them.
Yeah, they're probably very handsome editions. That's one of my favorite.
Oh, yeah.
The NYRB
Nice.
project is like one of the coolest things in publishing right now, I think. Yeah, has been for a while.
Absolutely. And all three of them look nice on a shelf together.
Yeah.
Like they, NYRB Classics is very good at, if they publish multiple books by a single author, they tend to try to like harmonize the aesthetic between the different volumes, and they've done that here.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I love it.
It's
You have
really,
a
really
great great article on Hayes. Ghostified, is that the title of it? I had it here, but
Ghostified, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I don't know if we have time to like get into why the title.
We could talk about it a little bit if you'd like. I haven't read any Hayes, but I really enjoyed your article, and I honestly, it's one of the few pieces of sort of literary criticism or whatever essay that actually I felt a little bit emotional, to be honest with you, because I was feeling some resonances there with sort of between the characters you're talking about, Hayes himself. The sort of link you're making to stuff that's really happening right now, even though Hayes hasn't been around for a minute. Yeah, I felt myself get that little twinge that I'm always looking for. So definitely people should go read that.
Well, then my work here is done, as they say. But really, I think there's different ways to be like a literary critic or literary essayist. And for me, the way is to really get inside the skin of the work and like look out through the eyes of the author, at the world in a lot of ways. I mean, I certainly have to create a certain amount of critical distance, but for me, I really immerse myself in the work and in the life. And I can't get on board with like these sort of hatchet job or take. I mean, I think some authors or books deserve to be given a hatchet job. I don't really have much interest in writing those things. Not because there isn't stuff worth criticizing, but because like I don't really want to spend that much time with work that I despise or hate. And when it comes to something like, I mean, this is a mid-century American male author who is writing these male characters, many of whom are, what would you say? They're like alienated from their own lives. The title Ghostified comes from, this one like 50-year-old character in his third novel, who used to be a successful screenwriter in Hollywood and then basically the work has dried up. He's over the hill. You know, the doors that used to be open to him are no longer open. The telephone isn't ringing. And then he also finds out that his wife has cheated on him. And he's telling someone about this, and he says, I should make the point here that this, meaning the infidelity, was all happening at the same time that the other thing was happening to me too. I mean, the way the jobs disappeared, the people hanging up on the phone, the being turned into a ghost. They do that to you, you know. They ghostify you. Oof. And, you know, it would be possible maybe as a critic today to look back and say, oh, he was whining, oh, poor him, you know, oh, I don't know, male narcissism or something like that. But I think it's a lot more worthwhile to take the work on its own terms and to, like, if there's pain behind it, try to understand that pain, you know. And anyway, that's a little maybe précis of my method. But
I love that. No, and this is I think you're speaking to one of the reasons I like your work so much too, because I don't care to read much criticism that's. It's not that I dislike it being negative, but yeah, this sort of like, well, if you didn't like it, why are you spending so much time telling me about it? Kind of thing, right? There's like, you know, just give me a thumbs down. It was no good.
Right.
But yeah, no, I really.
But I mean, it's like, I you know, another author I wrote about for City Journal years ago was like Sigismund Kurzeszanovsky, who was a fantastic, what we would call speculative fiction author in Soviet Russia, and his work was just suppressed throughout his entire life. Like every time he tried to publish it, the Soviet censors, you know, put the kibosh on it. Or I think the one time he was finally going to get it through, it got ruined by the advent of World War II or something like that. And he was this really cosmopolitan guy who read Shakespeare and had traveled in Europe prior to the Russian Revolution and the real, like, you know, Bolshevik oppression. But so when I'm writing about him and I'm reading his work, like, I am feeling the tragedy of what it would be like to go through your life producing work of that caliber and having it, for reasons that have nothing to do with its merit, just completely suppressed and almost consigned to oblivion. Like, it came very close to not ever being handed down to posterity. And so I try to, like, really mentally put myself in that place of, like, this is how horrible the Soviet, you know, system of oppression was. This is how horrible, you know. So anyway, it's not to, like, entirely take the author's perspective on everything, but it is to, like, take them on their own merits and to try to, like, take seriously the things that they took seriously, or to understand at least why they took them seriously, rather than, I think I was a little bit wrong earlier when I said, like, well, I don't want to, you know, I don't understand hatchet jobs. It's more that I don't understand dismissive criticism.
Right.
Not at least dismissive criticism of, like, high caliber work, you know, just because it might not be some. So maybe, you know, a feminist literary critic doesn't want to read a novel about, like, a man suffering loneliness and, you know, sexual frustration. Okay, like, fair enough. Right. But to just be dismissive of that as if that's not a genuine experience that someone had, or that was worth putting into between the covers of a book, like, I can't get on board with that.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
So,
well, should I talk about my
let's talk about your other thing
novel?
From the personal canon? Yes, please.
Okay, so the other one is Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry, which is just one of my absolute favorite novels of the 20th century. I think one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. And the brief plot synopsis, which in no way does it justice, is that Lowry recounts the last day in the life of a British consul in a Mexican town that is now Cuernavaca. And this consul is like a really serious alcoholic or dipsomaniac who is very far gone in his illness, and his wife has left him. And then suddenly she comes back to him after being gone for a year, and it's the Day of the Dead, 1938. And his younger brother shows up too, and they both try to kind of rescue him from himself, but it's very far from being a fairy tale reunion. And I think, much like Moby Dick or like Madame Bovary, we were saying, you can't really convey the power and strangeness of this novel with a synopsis. For me, Under the Volcano has a certain aura about it. It's like Blood Meridian in that way, or The Rings of Saturn, like, where it not only retains its luster with multiple readings, but it actually seems to stand apart from the category that it's in, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's not a perfect novel. It's not a Flaubertian novel, but what you might call its flaws, I think, only make it more deeply human. You know, we're talking about modernist authors, and Lowry had a kind of love-hate relationship with like the work of Joyce. He sort of absorbed it or was influenced by it through misunderstanding it. But as much as I love Ulysses, even like its wildest parts, like the sequence in Nighttown, or the long pastiche of the different historical prose styles, they seem controlled, right? Like Joyce's schema, his shaping hand are there. And Under the Volcano feels a lot more rickety. It feels as if like the wheels might come off, and Lowry maybe doesn't have full command of his material. And what makes it extraordinary is just the intensity and beauty and originality of the language and the imagery. It's like it's a true phantasmagoria, because the consul, as he drowns in drink or he does his best to sober up, his perceptions keep shifting and sliding and warping, and Mexico itself on the Day of the Dead is like a kind of phantasmagoria. And so the prose in which Lowry conveys all of this is just astonishing. And it's also a very funny book, as you know. I think you've read it. You said you really like it too.
Oh yeah.
Like there's a moment when the consul wakes up after a binge that has one of my favorite lines in English literature. Lowry describes him as having, let me see if I get this right. He describes him as having an inconceivable anguish of horripilating hangover thunderclapping about his skull. So,
that's and
yeah,
it's that's
unbelievable.
Great. But you can feel the Joyce. You can in that line. You can feel the Joyce sort of sneaking in there for sure. That's somebody who has read Joyce, and not in a derivative. Well, I guess slightly derivative, but not in a copying kind of way. Just like
no. And I don't think Joyce could have ever fathomed a setting like Mexico on the Day of the Dead, you know. But yeah, so that book holds a really special place in my mind. Horripilating, by the way, I thought for a while that Lowry had invented that it was like a neologism, but actually that word exists in the dictionary, and the technical meaning is like it's like it raises the hair on your arms, I think. Like it's hair raising, or it causes like goose flesh. Yeah. But with the more metaphorical sense of like something being nightmarish. And so he chose it, I think, probably for the alliteration, you know, with hangover, horripilating and hangover. And, you know, that's a great maybe moment of the le mot juste, where you could say like, well, why not just say nightmarish, or why not just say horrible, or what, you know, whatever. But like, there's a particular quality you get from the alliteration, from the multisyllabic, you know, quality of horripilating. And anyway,
and
great.
There's something in there which this is really interesting. There's something about using that word there where it kind of works even when you don't know what it means. Right.
Right. It has. I mean, it has the the beginning of horrible.
Right.
And you kind of take from context like, oh, this is like an intensifying adjective, right? Like it just it lets you know just how fucking bad the hangover is.
Right. No. I'm glad. I haven't thought about this book in a while, but it's a favorite of mine too. And you know, there are moments where I don't know that. And I could be wrong. I'm sure there are other examples that are approximate. The descriptions of alcoholism, or the effects of deep alcoholism, and the sort of delirium tremens. And this isn't just, you know, you have 6 drinks with your pals one night and you're like, oh boy, we went a little far last night. It's taking you. I mean, he's going through an experience not unlike. It's sort of different in kind in some ways, but it's not unlike the Temptations of St. Anthony, right? There's visions and weird things are happening, disorientation and confusion. And if I remember right, when Yvonne, his wife, shows up, there's like I believe there's like a moment where he's not sure if it's even happening or not, because he's so sort of, the consul is so disconnected from reality. And yet also like buried deep in reality somehow too. It's really kind of magical writing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a man who like has bottles of tequila like hidden around his yard, you know. He's plotting, after waking up with that hangover. He's like plotting how his neighbor is there watching him, and I think watering his garden, and the consul is trying to figure out how can he make it to the bottle of tequila without doing it openly so that his neighbor would be able to see it, and he's like sweating buckets and still wearing, you know, his consular uniform, I think, that he fell asleep in, and it's a very sweaty novel, but he's like trying to separate himself or stand outside his body to think, like, what picture do I make to my neighbor who's watching me? Do I look presentable? And he tries with that drunkard's kind of, if you've ever been around an alcoholic, the way they try to act like they have their shit together, you know, yes. And they have this exaggerated way of like walking or moving to try to act like, no, I am totally fine, you know, right. And that's it. But the analogy to St. Anthony is perfect, because actually the next part of that sentence with the horripilating hangover is, it says it's, you know, thunderclapping about his skull and accompanied by a protective screen of demons nattering in his ears.
Oh,
and
yeah,
so,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
It's like, of course, that's not literally true, but it puts you in that mindset of this man who is far gone. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of black humor in a way, because his alcoholism creates a lot of moments of humor, like what I just mentioned, where he's trying to conceal his true condition from his neighbor, but his neighbor, of course, sees through it, and you as the reader can tell the neighbor sees through it, and the neighbor is very disapproving of, you know, this British consul behaving in this manner and having let himself, you know, go so badly. And yeah, but there's like scenes of pastoral beauty as well. There's a part where his younger brother or half-brother rides horses with his wife, or kind of ex-wife, and they find themselves at a brewery, and like, it's just, that whole sequence is beautiful, and there's a lot of really astonishing set pieces, I guess you would say.
Oh
in
yeah,
there.
no, there's moments in there that are just absolutely just gorgeous. It's easy to get, and it's I think reasonable and easy to sort of get hung up in a good or bad way on the alcohol part, but overall it's just a beautiful book. I mean, Lowry, it's a shame that he didn't write more. I know I've read some of his short stories, which, to be honest, after reading Under the Volcano, I don't want to dismiss the man, but a little bit disappointing after reading Under the Volcano, to be honest. And he had another novel, Ultramarine, which I haven't read, but clearly just a massive
he also
talent.
He has one that I haven't read called Lunar Caustic, which is supposedly quite good. That one, some people have compared it to like Burroughs' Naked Lunch,
Interesting.
But have said or like E. Cummings' The Enormous Room, but have said it's actually better than those. So I'm interested to read that someday. But the real tragedy is he Lowry himself suffered from alcoholism, and with his second wife he lived in this shack on a beach.
I don't think you could write this book if you had been an alcoholic, at least at one point. Yeah.
No, but so he like lived in a squatter's shack on Vancouver Island with his second wife for years, and he wrote voluminously, but published nothing. And apparently his longest manuscript and many of his notes were lost when the shack burned down in 1945. Yeah. And so we don't know, unfortunately, like what the true scope of his legacy or his reputation should have been. But yeah, I think of what survived, Under the Volcano is head and shoulders above, you know, anything else he wrote, at least of what I've read and what I know by reputation. But
no, Lunar Caustic, I'm gonna have to look that up, because that sounds exactly in my wheelhouse. You know, it's this is a little bit anecdotal, it's neither here nor there, but I remember, and I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore, I remember years ago I was in Houston and visiting a friend there, and there was a bar. We went to this bar it was the Under the Volcano bar, and and you know, we went there because whatever, it's a novelty or whatever. But like, I got there and I'm like, man, this doesn't even feel appropriate to call a bar this. Do you know what I mean? It's like, did the person who named this bar read this book? Because I feel like it just feels dramatically inappropriate to like name it Under the Volcano, which is like the premier tragedy of alcohol, put it beautifully, but put between two covers. And the name of your bar after that, even though I was drinking my tiki drink and I was having a great time, there was a part of me that was just like, this is wrong. This feels terrible somehow.
Yeah. What would that be like if I'm trying to think of like an analogy for that, but you know, it's one thing to name a bar after Hemingway or something.
Right.
You know, we could maybe say that he had a problem with alcohol too, but by the standards of the time, not nearly as much as Lowry.
Yeah.
That's the incredible thing, is that Lowry was, you know, recognized as a dipsomaniac in the mid 20th century when people drank just
Right.
an astonishing amount. You hear people, I mean, like Patricia Highsmith was another one, you know, who wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley, and the amount, like, she drank so much, even by the standards of the time, that it was just, but the whole social scene was awash in alcohol back then.
Right.
And
Right.
you know, one of the things I think, since we were talking about Flaubert's like dual legacy, one of the things that might draw some people to read Under the Volcano, if you know, they wouldn't be drawn to it by hearing, oh, it's a great work of modernist literature, is that I don't know that Under the Volcano had an influence or a big influence on weird fiction writers at the time, but I do think like its sort of surreal, hallucinatory aspects would make it sit more comfortably next to a work of, you know, maybe a certain kind of fantasy novel than a mainstream literary novel nowadays. It has this intensely descriptive prose, as you know, in a way that kind of reminds me of world building or scene setting from like the best speculative fiction writers. And whereas a lot of what we call literary fiction today is actually very flat.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing Under the Volcano is not, it's flat. Right.
Right.
So,
right. No, I definitely.
yeah.
I mean, you know, I don't try to talk too much about like my own writing on the show necessarily, but like, I found a sort of psychedelic register in Lowry that I feel like I you know, have reached for in time in work since then, that I haven't seen
Right.
in work that was like actually in associated with sort of the proper psychedelia of like the 60s 70s. It's actually, in my opinion,
Right.
that kind of stuff is actually rendered better by Lowry than pretty much anybody else. So if that is any, you know, if somebody's out there not sure that's a book they want to read, but that kind of thing maybe appeals to them, I would definitely check it out. And it's one of the great books of the 20th century. I don't even see how a person would argue against that, but but tastes differ, I suppose.
No.
Yeah. Well,
No, it's
Brian,
just,
this
it's not,
has been,
you know, like I said,
go
it's
ahead.
not a perfect novel. It's just kind,
Right.
it's messy in a way, right? But it's like it, and that's the sad thing, is it's messy in a way that helps make it great, but which modern literary agents and editors might try to kind of amputate or neuter, and then we wonder why we don't have literature that, at least, you know, often in this country, maybe we can import it from other countries, you know, and get like Krasnohorkai or Bolaño, as we were talking about before the show started, and they have these messy or kind of wild, ambitious novels. But yeah, in this country, it seems like we try to make everything a little too neat and tidy, maybe, and you read a book and it's like, there's nothing objectionable about it, but there's nothing really astonishing either.
Yeah,
and so you kind of put it down and forget about it.
I just imagined a scene between a sort of contemporary scene between an editor and, you know, Malcolm Lowry if he was living now. And the editor's like, you know, this chapter doesn't quite make sense. And Malcolm's like, have you ever been drunk? Have you ever drank a bottle of
Or have you
mezcal
ever
by
been
yourself?
in Mexico?
Yeah, exactly. Of course it doesn't make sense. Right. Yeah.
Right. There's one of the funniest scenes is when the three principal characters are in this Mexican restaurant, and there's like a menu in English, but the translations are just so ridiculous. There's like
Forgot about that.
there's like a ghost of chicken or something is on the menu, or like so like what is it? Something like ectoplasm of ghost, or like I don't know, some just
weird.
really weird
Yeah.
translations. And you know, it's funny, even in the age of Google Translate, in the places that I've been to, you sometimes encounter stuff like that. You know, maybe not always quite that bad, but like there was when I went to Esztergom in Hungary, there was a restaurant where even the sign for the toilet with like an arrow pointing, and you kind of, if you know the layout of like the way restaurants are laid out, you know what it means. But it was not the Hungarian word for toilet, nor was it English. It was toilet, but spelled like TOALET. LLET, or like something crazy like TOA, like
Right.
LLET or something wild, and you're just like, but can't you just plug your own
Right.
word for toilet into Google Translate
Doesn't
and
seem
like
to be
check
that hard,
this?
right?
You have internet, like you have Wi-Fi at this restaurant, and you get stuff like that. There's this cafe in Budapest where I was going and working and like writing and reading a lot. And incredible, beautiful cafe that opened its doors in 1898,
Wow.
which is, so you get this cafe culture there, like in Paris or in Vienna, with an equally long history. But like the word they had on either side of the entry, they had, the sign listing kind of what is on offer in Hungarian, and then they had it in English, and like the word cocktails was missing the K, in the English version. And I'm thinking like, this is a famous
Right.
coffee house in Budapest, central Budapest, like a storied tradition of this establishment, and like you couldn't get that
get
word
the
right in
spelling
English.
right.
And that's not to make fun of them, it's just, but like these are the things that, and so Lowry draws on that for humor. I mean, he finds humor in a lot of his own character situation, but also the setting that his characters are moving through. But then it becomes quite tragic by the end, I have to say.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah,
yeah. We won't spoil it for people who haven't read it, but it's
I know.
a masterpiece.
I've said enough.
Yeah,
I've
it
said
should
too
go.
much.
It should go to the top
Yeah.
of everybody's list. Well,
Absolutely.
Brian, this has been so
If
much
my
fun.
rambling hasn't convinced you.
Yeah, right. I think I actually, to the end of this, I'm gonna read like a page or two and just tack it on to the end of Under the Volcano, just so.
Oh, you're gonna read it out loud? That'd be awesome.
I just
yeah.
decided to do that just now. So, but
Yeah, please do.
yeah, Brian, this has been so much
Next
fun.
time I'll prepare one and you can prepare one, and we'll do like dueling,
There we go.
passages or something.
I like that.
That'd be
I like
great.
that a lot. This has been so much fun. I'll have tell people real quick where to find you. They'll be in the show notes, but in case they're listening, tell people where they can find you real quick.
Sure, yeah. So pretty much the only social media platform I use is X, and I don't even use it terribly often in terms of posting because my account is very old and has been dragged down by algorithms past. And so even though I have a decent following, my posts never really seem to reach many people. But you can find me there at Brian Eha. Yeah. So,
Awesome.
and then, I mean, I can talk about where to find some of my work, but right now I'm working on a long essay about Ralph Waldo Emerson for an upcoming issue of City Journal, which you've mentioned it already as like the place where my Flaubert essay was published. And I really have to plug it as an excellent quarterly magazine on politics, culture, and urban affairs. I write for them a lot, mainly because they sort of let me do what I'm passionate about, and they let me do it at the length that I think is necessary to do it justice. And there just aren't that many outlets nowadays that will publish 4,000, 5,000 word essays on, Flaubert and Kafka and Alfred Hayes. So, and pay well for doing it. So I feel fortunate to be able to, get those commissions.
That's awesome. Yeah. Again, Brian, thank you. For folks listening, thank you for checking in. We've got coming up, we'll be talking about The Magus by John Fowles with Alexandra Constantine from the Black Ibis Social Club, and American Tabloid is coming up. And what's the other one? Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. I've been wanting to talk about Gene Wolfe forever.
Oh, okay.
So
Book of the New Sun.
just the first volume. I don't have the bandwidth to read all of them at the moment. Eventually, we'll get to some more of them. But just as a little teaser for people who are listening along, you can look forward to episodes.
Everyone who wants to read Dune or thinks they do should read Gene Wolfe instead. That's my pitch to them.
Gene Wolfe is definitely up there. He's an example of a guy who has as good a chops as anybody, but is sort of got a little bit ghettoized in genre.
Right. Yeah, I think like Samuel R. Delany might be another example of that, with a novel like Dahlgren, which is every bit as difficult and strange and complex as, a work of high modernism, but he's been kind of shunted over to the, speculative fiction genre. Yeah. And some of his works are openly, avowedly speculative fiction, but, not all of them, and not to the exclusion of having literary merit. So, if I can just say one more thing for myself, I will say, I write for other places besides City Journal, of course, and I am always looking for more places that want thoughtful literary prose or, well-crafted personal essays and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I had a long essay published in the May issue of First Things, of a blend of like lit crit, personal essay, and journalism. It was about Helen DeWitt's novel The Last Samurai. I don't know if you've read that.
I have not.
But it's you'll know if you've read the novel why this ties in. But it was about The Last Samurai and my experience of being homeschooled as a kid. Which is an experience about which I remain deeply ambivalent, and also the rise in homeschooling that we're seeing nationwide, which is kind of like the journalistic piece of it. So that was an interesting one. I like doing things that kind of are not neatly categorizable, I suppose.
Yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, absolutely. Folks, check that out, and I'll see you guys all soon. Thank you very much. For a time, they confronted each other like two mute, unspeaking forts. The water, still trickling into the pool, God, how deadeningly slow, filled the silence between them. There was something else. The consul imagined he still heard the music of the ball, which must have long since ceased, so that this silence was pervaded with a stale thudding of drums. Pariah, that meant drums too. Perian. It was doubtless the almost tactile absence of the music, however, that made it so peculiar the trees should be apparently shaking to it, an illusion investing not only the garden, but the plains beyond, the whole scene before his eyes, with horror, the horror of an intolerable unreality. This must be not unlike, he told himself, what some insane person suffers at those moments when, sitting benignly in the asylum grounds, madness suddenly ceases to be a refuge and becomes incarnate in the shattering sky and all his surroundings, in the presence of which reason, already struck dumb, can only bow the head. Does the madman find solace at such moments, as his thoughts, like cannonballs, crash through his brain in the exquisite beauty of the madhouse garden or of the neighboring hills beyond the terrible chimney? Hardly, the consul felt. As for this particular beauty, he knew it dead as his marriage and as willfully slaughtered, the sun shining brilliantly now on all the world before him, its rays picking out the timberline of Popocatépetl, as its summit, like a giant surfacing whale, shouldered out of the clouds again. All this could not lift his spirit. The sunlight could not share his burden of conscience or of sourceless sorrow. It did not know him. Down to his left, beyond the plantains, the gardener at the Argentinian ambassador's weekend residence was slashing his way through some tall grasses, clearing the ground for a badminton court. Yet something about this innocent enough occupation contained a horrible threat against him. The broad leaves of the plantains themselves, drooping gently, seemed menacingly savage as the stretched wings of pelicans shaking before they fold. The movements of some more little red birds in the garden, like animated rosebuds, appeared unbearably jittery and thievish. It was as though the creatures were attached by sensitive wires to his nerves. When the telephone rang, his heart almost stopped beating.